Okay, hi ladies. This is a review and overview of the structure of the Iranian government. I wanted to do this so that we have time to get to some more current events, which is the really exciting stuff. But to understand the exciting stuff, you have to understand the structure. So we're going to go through this pretty quickly. So just to set the stage, pre-1979. So remember, this is during the time of the picture that I showed you earlier where the women were in Western dress. That was during the Pahlavi era when Shah Reza Khan was in power. And so he took power, and remember, he was kind of a jerk. He took power in a coup d'etat, and he gave power to his son in 1941. But again, his name was Reza Khan as well. And they faced some democratic opposition, but they were really quick to snuff that opposition out. So under the Pahlavis, it was a rentier state. We covered this during the last lecture, which means that they had only one export, and that export was oil. They really depended on oil, and what they did is they rented out segments of oil fields and rented them out to foreign countries, and that's what you call a rentier state. So it's heavily supported by state expenditure, while the state receives rent from other countries. And so they had to encourage import substitution industrialization, which encourages the country to produce the products that the country needs. Because they were so dependent on oil, it meant that their entire economy surrounded around oil and supporting oil, but that they couldn't, for example, produce enough food for the country to survive. So they had to import a lot of their food. So the government had to encourage people to start producing food and other commodities that were necessary for the population to survive, and so that there wasn't crazy inflation for those necessary commodities. So the democratic opposition that I referred to earlier was really led by this guy named Mohammad Mossadegh. And Mossadegh led a group called the National Front, and he was the main democratic opposition to Reza Khan. They really emphasized Iranian nationalism, and you're going to hear a lot about this Iranian nationalism. People are very proud to be Iranian, and that's something that carries through to the present day. And that's important because that helps to distinguish. Iranians think of themselves as very different, right, as a different nation, if you will, from Iraqi Muslims or any other Muslims in the Middle East, because they are their own country, right? They are Iranian. So you're going to hear that come up time and time again. Iranian nationalism can be very strong, but the question is, for a lot of people, are Iranian nationalism and Islamic fundamentalism the same, or are those two different things? And Mohammad Mossadegh felt that Iranian nationalism meant that there should have been more emphasis on democracy. And you'll remember back, Shah Reza Khan was really friendly with the West and was trying to rapidly westernize the country. And Mossadegh felt that there should have been more democracy, but that maybe things shouldn't have been so westernized. So you'll hear it later. So he nationalized the British-owned company that monopolized Iran's oil, and he was actually elected prime minister in 1951. And this is where it gets a little confusing. Currently, Iran does not have a prime minister, but they tried it out for a little bit and then decided it didn't work out for them, and then they got rid of the prime minister. So he was elected prime minister in 1951, but I want to say 1953, they decided they didn't like him. And this is when the UK and the US actually interfered with the Iranian government and reinstalled the Shah. And remember, this is that brutal, really not nice guy. He was really brutal against his own people. And this is when there was a lot of violence against his own people. So the US and the UK reinstalled the Shah to contain Soviet power during the Cold War. So they didn't like the idea of having any sort of communist influences in the region, and so they interfered with the government. So they helped to reinstall Shah Reza Khan instead of Mossadegh. They kicked out Mossadegh and reinstalled Reza Khan. And Reza Khan's the guy that, like I said, westernized and secularized Iran, right? So he moved away from Islamic values and moved towards the West. And he really emphasized ties with the U.S., but there was huge pushback from the religious clerics who felt that they were moving away from Islam way too quickly and way too much. So during this time, there was this guy named Ayatollah Khomeini, and an Ayatollah is it's a very highly trained Islamic cleric. And you'll remember a cleric is like a religious leader. So it goes cleric and mullah are the same terms. Cleric and mullah mean kind of the same thing. And then you go to Ayatollah. And then there's the next thing, which is called a grand Ayatollah. And while a grand Ayatollah technically is higher up, they actually tend not to have that much more power than the regular Ayatollahs. But it's just another title kind of on your name. So just so you know the hierarchy. So Khomeini was this Islamic fundamentalist leader who set himself up within Iran as the anti-Shah. And so he was kind of outspoken, and as a religious leader, he was pretty influential. So he had huge resentments towards the elite of the country, who were generally making profits off of oil, and the U.S. He felt that the U.S. was the great Satan, and he felt like Reza Khan was moving away from Islamic values way too quickly and was very, very outspoken about it. Reza Khan didn't like that he was so outspoken, so he actually exiled Khomeini to Paris. So he left the country. He was exiled. Khomeini left the country and was exiled to Paris. Then, this is the date that's really, really important, is the revolution of 1979 came around. And during the revolution, so the Shah was seen as anti-Islamic, and there was kind of rising sentiment where people really didn't like that. People felt like Islam was an essential part of their government and that the Shah needed to incorporate that into their culture. Then, on top of this, there was an economic downturn, and you guys read about the revolution of rising expectations in the text, so I'm not going to define that. And there was a popular uprising. People wanted a return to Muslim values, and so they started protesting in the streets, and then that, of course, prompted the Shah to crack down even harder and really violently against his own people, and that prompted even more unrest. And so then in January of 1979, the Shah realized that he was losing power way too quickly and that there was really no way to salvage his reputation at this point, and so he fled to Egypt. So Ayatollah Khomeini was in Paris at the time, but he had been sending in these audio tapes of kind of really powerful rhetoric where he was encouraging the people to revolt. And in February of 1979, he flew into Iran just in time to save the day, right? He was welcomed back with open arms, and the people of Iran were championing him as the new leader of Iran in February of 1979. So Ayatollah Khomeini comes in, and he ended up becoming what is now called the supreme leader. And we're going to get to the actual structure of government in a little bit, but now you'll just need to know that Ayatollah Khomeini was the first supreme leader. He ruled from 1979 to 1989. And he is the guy who reunited the state and religion. So you'll hear there's the term kind of, there was no separation of mosque and state. And he renamed he named it the Islamic Republic of Iran, right? So the Islamic Republic of Iran. And his official title was Leader of the Revolution, Founder of the Islamic Republic, Guide of the Oppressed Masses, Commander of the Armed Forces, and Imam of the Muslim world. It's quite a mouthful. But again, as I mentioned, he was welcomed back with open arms. So what kind of leader and what kind of legitimacy does that help him to have? Charismatic. So at the time, right, everybody was pretty upset with Reza Khan. There was pretty high anti-Western sentiment, and the Shah kind of epitomized this. He was this Islamic cleric, and he came in on a platform of anti-Western sentiment, And so he was able to write a constitution when he returned in February of 1979, and he snuck it in really quickly. It was approved, and everybody accepted him as the supreme leader. So we showed a little bit of this in class about the Iranian Revolution, but if you want to, you can take a look at this now.
Fundamentalism took hold with a fury and a force that helped ignite the still impoverished masses in Iran, who felt they had little reason to be grateful to the Shah. The fabulous profits from oil had not filtered down to them. Autumn 1978. Anti-Shah demonstrations had grown to such proportions that the Shah declared martial law in most of Iran's cities. The crowd shouted death to the Shah. Among the despised symbols of their monarch, the marchers raised pictures of the Shah's antagonist, the bearded, fierce-eyed holy man, Ayatollah Khomeini.
The preoccupation in Tehran still seems to be over whether the Shah would leave Iran once a new civilian government is formed.
From his exile in France, Khomeini was the chief fomenter, the mastermind, and eventually the inheritor of Iran's Islamic Revolution. The Shah secluded himself in his palace, surrounded only by friends, courtiers, and officers.
Hello. Happy New Year. The Empress took charge, shepherding the photographers outside for pictures. In undergoing this obviously painful meeting with the news media, the Shah seemed to be saying, "Here I am at my palace, and here I will stay."
I fully expect the Shah to maintain power in Iran and for the present problems in Iran to be resolved.
President
Shah
Carter
has our support, and he also has our confidence.
On the advice of the United States, he ordered his troops to avoid confrontation. It was advice the Shah would soon regret. By January of 1979, it was clear the Shah could no longer reign.
A tearful Shah of Iran left his country today on a vacation from which he may never return.
President and Mrs. Sadat greeted the royal couple as the Presidential Guard played national anthem.
And for the first time since violent anti-Shah protests began in Iran more than a year ago, there were celebrations in the streets of Tehran.
The Shah's departure made Ayatollah Khomeini, in effect, the new ruler of Iran.
The scene was euphoric as Ayatollah Khomeini emerged from his house. Chaotic, too, as several hundred people descended on the area after learning that the 78-year-old Muslim leader would return to Iran Friday after a 15-year exile. In a speech lasting about 45 minutes, Khomeini congratulated his followers and pleaded for unity. "We have kicked out the Shah," he said, "but the revolution is not over."
There was a triumphant and tumultuous welcome in Tehran today by more than 1 million Iranians for the Ayatollah Khomeini, returning home from 15 years of exile. He demanded that the government resign at once or face arrest, and that foreigners, especially Americans, get out.
For security reasons, the airport has been sealed off to the general public, and Khomeini's first few moments on Iranian soil were subdued. It was the quiet before the storm. The motorcade crowds were the most emotional near the University of Tehran, where scores of pro-Khomeini demonstrators have been wounded or killed by Iranian troops in the past week. It was here that Khomeini's security-conscious aides had to fight their way through a mass of devotion. Each step of the way, Khomeini left behind screaming admirers who tried to run after the entourage or leap aboard the official buses. Others stayed behind and held spontaneous street celebrations.
"Greetings to you, Khomeini," they chanted, surging toward him, desperate to touch the hand or robe of the holy man, or to have something, anything, touched and blessed by him. To touch him, one man said, is to touch the person who speaks to God.
A new and more turbulent era for Iran had begun. The reign of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the man who ruled Iran through 4 decades, came to an end.
Okay, so another big part of the Iranian hostage crisis, before we move on, I just wanted to point out that things have to get pretty bad for people to revolt like that, especially when there is a military state. So keep in mind that things were pretty bad just before the 1979 revolution. In a state with martial law, that's the state using violence against its own population. So it was pretty high risk to be able to revolt like that. And you heard in the video that there were several students that were killed in a pro-Khomeini, anti-Reza Khan rally. So keep that in mind, that things were pretty bad pre-1979, and that Ayatollah Khomeini came in with huge charismatic legitimacy. People were, trying to touch him. They said, the quote that really stood out to me is that to touch him is to touch the person who speaks to God. So keep in mind, that's where his legitimacy comes from. So part of the Iranian Revolution of 1979 was also the American hostage crisis. So I don't want to get too into this because I know somebody is going to speak about this when they talk about the U.S.-Iranian relations, but the American hostage crisis is pretty fascinating. And it happened on November 4th, 1979. There were a group of protesters that stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, and they took 60 hostages for 444 days. They finally released them before Reagan took office in January of 1981. So it's almost 2 years later, or just over a year later. And part of it was that they didn't like that the Shah Reza Khan had gone to the U.S. for cancer treatment. And the U.S. was kind of harboring him. And they wanted to bring Reza Khan back to Iran to be to face kind of prosecution in trial by law, by Sharia law. They felt like his crimes were so atrocious against his own people that he needed to account for those claims, and they felt that President Carter was harboring him in the U.S. So they held on to these hostages until 1981, when Reagan ended up winning the election, and a few hours before he was about to take office in 1981. Some people say that this is why Carter ended up losing the election, or his re-election, was because of the Iranian hostage crisis. It was huge all over the news around this time. Another really interesting clip that I would love for you guys to take a peek at, if you'd like, I'd like for you to pause the video and to open this link and to watch this trailer. It's a short trailer, but it's a graphic novel, and it talks about one girl's experiences in Iran and compares them to her experience in Paris. She ended up being sent away by her parents for her safety, and it's a really interesting take on it. I would really highly recommend you take a look at it, just so you can really understand what it was like in Iran during this time. So, the 1979 Constitution, which, remember, was instituted by Ayatollah Khomeini and passed by Ayatollah Khomeini, is what created the government as we know it today in Iran. And I'm actually going to pause this video just so that it's easier for me to upload, so it's not too long. And I'm going to upload another video, which I will ask you to watch next. So I'm going to upload this now, and then I'll upload the next one, which is all about the government structure. So both are essential for you to watch. See you in a little bit.